They turned murder into a religion, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, an actual, organized, disciplined religion, where the killers didn't run, where they didn't hide, where they stood over their victims in broad daylight, surrounded by guards, surrounded by witnesses, and waited to be captured. Because being captured was part of the message. The message being, we can reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. We already have. You're next. Imagine being a king, a real king, walls 20 feet thick, 100 guards who have served you for years, food tasters at every meal. You have survived wars, survived coups, survived everything the medieval world could throw at a man with power. And then one morning, you wake up and there's a note on your pillow, a poisoned cake sitting beside it, and the note says simply, "We were here. We chose not to act. This time." That actually happened to one of the most feared military commanders in history, a man who had never lost a battle, a man who had united an entire civilization under his banner. He made peace with them within a week, because he understood something that most rulers took years to learn, that there is no wall thick enough, no guard loyal enough, no room private enough to stop a man who has spent 2 years earning your complete and total trust before the order ever came. That was their weapon, not the blade, the patience before the blade. They didn't recruit killers. They recruited brilliant, disciplined, deeply intelligent men, taught them languages, court etiquette, how to dress like a noble, how to pray like whatever religion the court they were entering happened to follow, how to make themselves indispensable, how to wait months, sometimes years, becoming the servant you relied on most, the advisor you trusted completely, the guard you never questioned. And then, when the moment was chosen, not by them, but by a man sitting in a mountain fortress hundreds of miles away, they acted, once, cleanly, and they did not run. Because at their peak, death wasn't even the point anymore. Fear was the product. Death was just the invoice. And the entire medieval world was paying. Sultans, caliphs, crusader kings, all of them sending tribute to a mountain, not because they had lost a war, because they understood that the alternative was a quiet morning and a note on their pillow. For nearly 200 years, this worked perfectly. And here is the part that will genuinely change how you see this entire story. Almost everything you have ever heard about them is wrong. The Paradise Garden, the drugs, the fanatical followers who believed they were already dead, almost all of it was invented, written by enemies who needed a monster to explain something they couldn't understand. How does a small group of scholars in a mountain fortress make the most powerful rulers on earth afraid to sleep? They couldn't be rational. They had to be insane. They had to be drugged. They had to be brainwashed. Except they weren't. And the real explanation, the actual truth of what the assassins were, how they worked, why they were so devastatingly effective, is more intelligent, more calculated, and so much more terrifying than the myth. We are going to go through all of it today. But first, and I genuinely need you to do this for your own safety, subscribe and hit the bell, because the old man of the mountain keeps a list, and people who don't subscribe tend to end up on it. I'm probably joking. Stick around. Before there were assassins, there was one man. And if you want to understand everything that comes after, the fortresses, the killings, the terror, the myth, you have to understand him first. His name was Hassan-i-Sabbah, and from the moment he was born, it was clear this was not going to be an ordinary life. He grew up in Persia in the 11th century, the son of a Shia Muslim family, and by the time he was a teenager, he was already one of the most intellectually formidable young men in his city. He didn't just study religion, he studied everything: mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. He had one of those minds that doesn't stop, the kind that picks up a subject, tears it apart completely, puts it back together, and then immediately starts on the next one. And then he encountered Ismaili Islam. Now, I'm going to keep the theological stuff brief because this is a history channel, not a seminary, but the basics matter here. Islam at this point in history was deeply, violently divided. The Sunni Abbasid Caliphate controlled most of the Islamic world, and they held that political and religious authority should go to the community's chosen leaders. The Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam, believed something completely different. They believed that true religious authority ran in a direct line from the Prophet through his descendants, and that the current rulers of the Islamic world were not just wrong, but actively illegitimate. This was not a minor theological disagreement. This was a declaration that the entire political order of the medieval Islamic world had no right to exist. Hassan converted, fully, completely, and immediately started thinking about what to do about it. He traveled to Egypt, to the Ismaili Fatimid court in Cairo, one of the most sophisticated cities in the medieval world. He studied, he schemed, he built connections. He observed how power actually worked, not in theory, not in scripture, but in practice. And somewhere during those years in Cairo, he developed an idea so radical, so precise, so cold-bloodedly practical that it would reshape the medieval world. If you cannot beat the existing power structure through conventional means, through armies, through territory, through wealth, then you don't fight the structure. You remove the people who hold it together, carefully, patiently, surgically. He returned to Persia with a plan, and he had his eye on a particular mountain. The Valley of Alamut sits in the Alborz mountain range in northern Persia. If you've never seen pictures of it, go look some up after this video, because the geography alone is extraordinary. Sheer cliff faces, narrow passes, a location so naturally defensible that the fortress built there seemed almost unnecessary. Nature had already done most of the work. Hassan wanted it. And here is the first moment in this story where you realize that Hassan Isabah was operating on a completely different level from everyone around him. Because he didn't attack the fortress, he didn't lay siege to it, he didn't bribe the garrison or assassinate the commander. He sent people ahead of him, years ahead of him. Quietly, patiently, his agents entered the valley and began converting the population. The farmers, the craftsmen, the locals, the people whose children worked in the fortress. Person by person, family by family, they were brought into the Ismaili movement until, by the time Hassan himself arrived in 1090, a significant portion of the people connected to Alamut already owed their loyalty to him. When the fortress commander finally realized what had happened, when he understood that the man who had just walked through his gates had been building support around his walls for years, he was simply asked to leave. Hassan paid him 3,000 gold dinars for his trouble. The man took the money and left. No battle, no blood, no siege, just patience, intelligence, and the understanding that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the one you use last, it's the one your enemy never sees coming. Hassan moved in and immediately started building, not just fortifications, a library, an observatory, laboratories, gardens. He was creating not just a military base, but a civilization, a small, self-sufficient, intellectually extraordinary civilization perched on a cliff face in the middle of the mountains. And from that single fortress, he began a network that would eventually stretch across 2,000 miles of the medieval world. Here is something the movies always get wrong about the assassins. They show them as a shadowy underground organization, lurking in sewers and basements, moving in darkness. The reality is almost the opposite. Hassan Isabah didn't build a secret criminal network. He built a state, a distributed, mountain-based, deeply organized state that just happened to have a very unusual foreign policy. From Alamut, he dispatched agents called da'i, missionaries, essentially. though that word doesn't quite capture what they were. These were educated, trained, deeply ideologically committed men sent into cities, courts, and villages across the Islamic world to spread the Ismaili message and identify potential recruits. They didn't just preach, they assessed. They were looking for a very specific type of person: intelligent, disciplined, ideologically motivated, capable of extraordinary patience. When they found someone, the real work began. The recruitment process was gradual, methodical, designed to build absolute commitment at every stage before moving to the next. And while this was happening across hundreds of locations simultaneously, Hassan was acquiring more fortresses, not through conquest, through the same method he'd used at Alamut: infiltration, conversion, and the strategic placement of loyal people inside structures that hadn't yet realized they were being hollowed out. By the time the Seljuk rulers of Persia understood what was happening, there were Ismaili strongholds scattered throughout their territory like thorns in a carpet. You couldn't remove one without bleeding. You couldn't remove all of them without an army tied up for decades. And even then, even if you took every fortress, you still had no idea how many of the people around you had been turned. That uncertainty was the weapon, not the fortresses, the not knowing. Think about how genius that is. You don't need to win. You just need your enemy to not be able to trust anyone. Once you've achieved that, you've already won the psychological war. And the psychological war was always the one Hassan Isabah was actually fighting. So who actually did the killing? Who were these men? And here I want to completely destroy the image you probably have in your head: the drugged, fanatical, mindless zealot who died because he was too brainwashed to know better. The operatives who carried out assassinations were called fadai. The word means, roughly, one who sacrifices himself. And they were the opposite of mindless. The selection process for a fadai was extraordinarily rigorous. You were not recruited off the street. You were observed, assessed, and approached only after the dai in your area had concluded that you had the specific qualities required. Intelligence was non-negotiable. Discipline was non-negotiable. The ability to maintain a cover identity, to become someone else entirely and sustain that performance for months or years, that was the core skill. Because here is how a fadai operation actually worked. The target would be identified, a political or military figure whose removal served the movement's strategic goals. Then, the process of getting close to them would begin. An agent would enter that person's world, not as a stranger, but as something they needed. A secretary, a servant, a soldier, a religious scholar. Whatever role created the most access. And they would build that relationship over months, sometimes years. They would become trusted, relied upon. And then, when the order came from Alamut, not before, never before, they would act. The reason they didn't run afterward is something historians still find fascinating. It wasn't because they were crazy. It was because running served no purpose. The killing was always done in public, deliberately, in front of as many witnesses as possible, because the message only worked if everyone saw it. If a king's most trusted advisor suddenly killed him in a crowd and vanished, that's a mystery, a conspiracy, maybe even an accident. But if that same advisor kills him and then stands there calmly surrounded by guards and announces who sent him, that's a statement. That's a demonstration. That's the assassin saying to every ruler watching, "We are already inside your court, right now, today, and there is nothing you can do about it." Now we need to talk about the hashish story, because it is everywhere. Every documentary about the assassins eventually gets to the part where a narrator solemnly explains that Hassan Isabah would drug his recruits with hashish, wake them up in a beautiful garden full of food and music and beautiful people, tell them they were in paradise, drug them again, wake them back up in a cell, and explain that if they served him faithfully and died in his cause, they would return to paradise permanently. This is a great story. It is almost certainly not true. The word assassin itself comes from hashishin, which medieval Arabic sources used as a term of abuse for the Nizari Ismailis, but the precise meaning of that word is genuinely contested. It may refer to hashish users. It may be a corruption of asasiyun, meaning people who are faithful to the foundation, referring to their ideological foundations. We genuinely don't know. What we do know is that the Paradise Garden story comes primarily from one source, Marco Polo, who visited Persia about 30 years after the assassins had already been destroyed by the Mongols, who never met an actual assassin, and who was traveling through a region where the defeated enemy's reputation had been thoroughly savaged by their conquerors. There's also an Arabic source, a traveler named Ibn Battuta, who repeats a similar story, and there are a handful of European crusader accounts, all of them written by outsiders, all of them writing about a group they feared, didn't understand, and had every reason to demonize. Meanwhile, what do we actually know about how the Fidai were motivated? They were deeply theologically motivated by a genuine belief that what they were doing was spiritually correct. They were selected precisely for their intelligence and ideological commitment. They were not men who needed to be tricked into serving because they couldn't think for themselves. They served because they believed. That's actually more frightening than the drug story, isn't it? A man who is drugged and deceived can be undeceived. A man who has thought deeply about his values and concluded that his cause is worth his life. That man is a completely different proposition. Let's talk about what they actually did, because the operational history of the assassins is extraordinary, both for what it achieved and for how precisely it was calculated. The targets were never random. There was a strategic logic to every killing. The assassins were not terrorists in the modern sense. They weren't trying to create mass fear in a population. They were targeting specific individuals whose removal would shift the political balance in ways that benefited the Nizari Ismaili movement. The very first major assassination, the one that announced to the medieval world that something entirely new had arrived, was the killing of Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire in 1092. He was the most powerful administrator in the Islamic world, the man who actually ran the empire. Hassan sent an agent who had spent months in the vizier's retinue, dressed as a Sufi holy man, close enough to present a petition. He drove a dagger into the vizier's chest and was killed immediately. The operation succeeded completely. The Seljuk Empire, already under political strain, fractured, which was exactly the point. Then there was the killing of Conrad of Montferrat, the newly crowned king of Jerusalem, struck down in the street by two men who had spent months in the city posing as Christian monks. That one caused a diplomatic crisis that rippled across the entire Crusader world, with everyone accusing everyone else of having ordered it, which was also, almost certainly, the point. Make your enemies distrust each other. And then there is the story I mentioned in the hook, the note on Saladin's pillow. Multiple attempts on the greatest military commander of the era all failing because Saladin's security was exceptional, followed by the morning he woke to find proof that his bedroom had been entered in the night, a poisoned cake left beside him, and a note explaining that they had chosen not to act. He sent an ambassador to Alamut within days. A peace was negotiated. The assassins demonstrated that they could reach Saladin any time they chose, and Saladin demonstrated that he was rational enough to recognize it. Nobody died, which was, in its own way, their most impressive operation. Here is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the popular version. The assassins and the Crusaders, the Islamic revolutionary movement, and the Christian military occupation of the Holy Land had a relationship that was complicated, pragmatic, and at times almost friendly. And that makes complete sense when you think about it, because the assassins' primary enemies were Sunni Muslim rulers. The Crusader states were also fighting Sunni Muslim rulers, the enemy of your enemy and all that. The Crusaders paid tribute to the assassins, not because they were conquered, because it was rational. The assassins had a base in the Nusairiyah mountains in Syria. close enough to Crusader territory to be relevant, and paying them removed you from the target list and occasionally bought you useful intelligence about shared enemies. The assassins in Syria, led by a man called Rashid al-Din Sinan, who the Crusaders called the Old Man of the Mountain, was in many ways even more politically sophisticated than his counterparts in Persia. He corresponded with European rulers directly. There are letters between Sinan and the King of Jerusalem. There is a documented exchange with the Holy Roman Emperor. There was a moment, genuinely documented, when the Syrian assassins sent an ambassador to the Crusader court suggesting the possibility of a formal alliance and even, potentially, conversion to Christianity. The Crusaders killed the ambassador on his way home. The Templars did it, apparently, to protect their own tribute payments, which would have been disrupted if the assassins converted and were absorbed into the Christian world. So, to be clear, the Crusaders murdered a diplomatic envoy from a group that was trying to join their side because it was bad for business. Medieval politics, everyone. Genuinely unhinged. I want to slow down here for a moment and give you a picture of what Alamut actually was, because the popular imagination turns it into a dark tower full of daggers and poison and nothing else. The reality is more interesting and in some ways more unsettling because it is more human. Alamut, under Hassan-i-Sabbah and his successors, was a genuine center of learning. The library at Alamut was one of the finest in the Islamic world. Thousands of manuscripts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, theology. Hassan himself wrote theological treatises. He developed a doctrine called talim, the principle that true knowledge requires a living teacher, an authoritative interpreter, not just a text, that was sophisticated enough to attract serious intellectual responses from major Islamic scholars, including, famously, Al-Ghazali, one of the greatest thinkers of the medieval period. There was an observatory at Alamut producing real astronomical research. There were gardens, not the paradise fantasy, but actual functional gardens producing food for a self-sufficient community. There were women and children living there. This was not a barracks, it was a civilization. And when later Nizari leaders took over after Hassan died in 1124, the movement continued to develop intellectually and theologically. There were periods of relative openness even. One Grand Master famously declared the end of Islamic law and a new era of spiritual freedom, which went down about as well as you'd expect with the more traditionally minded members of the movement. The point is that for nearly 2 centuries, Alamut was simultaneously a political and military organization, a theological movement, an intellectual institution, and a functioning community. The killing was real, the fear was real, but it was the outer edge of something much more complex, which makes what happened next all the more devastating. In 1256, Hulagu Khan arrived in Persia. Hulagu was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he had been given a specific mission by the Mongol leadership: pacify the Islamic West, remove the obstacles, all of them. The assassins were first on the list, and here the story becomes genuinely tragic, because the Nizari Ismailis tried everything. The Grand Master at the time, Rukunuddin Khurshah, tried diplomacy first. He sent envoys to the Mongol court. He offered submission. He negotiated. He stalled. He was probably buying time, hoping that the Mongols would be called away by events elsewhere, as had happened before. They weren't. Hulagu simply waited him out and then advanced on Alamut with an army that had recently destroyed nations. There was no army that could relieve the fortress. There was no network of allies that could be called. There was no political maneuver left. The Fidai, the operatives built for infiltration and precise removal of individuals, had no function against a force that was simply going to besiege every fortress until it fell and then burn what was inside. Rukunuddin surrendered in November 1256. He was promised safety. He was taken to meet the great Khan in Mongolia, and when the Khan decided he was not worth keeping, he was killed. thrown from his horse according to some accounts, and then executed. His family was hunted down. The assassin fortresses across Persia were destroyed one by one. The library at Alamut, thousands of manuscripts representing 2 centuries of scholarship, was burned. Some accounts say one scholar managed to save a portion of the collection. Most of it was gone. The Syrian branch survived longer, holding out in their mountain fortresses until the Mamluk Sultan Baybars finally dismantled them in the 1270s, absorbing some, destroying others, folding the remaining Ismaili population into the general Muslim community. The organized assassin network, the one that had made the medieval world afraid, was finished.
But here is what didn't die. A word. The Crusaders brought the word Hashishin back to Europe. It filtered through Italian, assassino, through French, assassin, and eventually into English, and then into every major language on Earth. Today, in the 21st century, in the year you are watching this video, every time anyone anywhere uses the word assassin, in a news report, in a novel, in a conversation, they are using a word that was coined to describe a specific group of people who lived in Persian mountain fortresses 900 years ago. That is an extraordinary kind of immortality. But the legacy goes deeper than a word. The Nizari Ismaili Muslims, the descendants of the community Hassani Sabah founded, still exist. There are an estimated 15 million of them today. They are led by the Aga Khan, who traces his lineage directly to the Imam Hassani Sabah served. They are one of the most progressive Muslim communities on earth, deeply committed to education, women's rights, and development work across Asia and Africa. The organization that was feared across the medieval world as a nest of killers is now one of the most significant philanthropic forces in the developing world. And the fortress of Alamut still stands, or what's left of it. You can visit it. People do. You walk up the same mountain that Hassani Sabah walked up in 1090, and you stand on what remains of the library that Hulagu Khan burned, and you look out at the valley below, and you try to imagine what it felt like to have built something so extraordinary in such an unlikely place. And maybe you feel it, just slightly, the thing that everyone who encountered the assassins felt. The sense that somewhere out there, someone is watching, planning, waiting. I'm sure it's nothing. And that is the story of the assassins. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you. This was a deep one, and you stuck with it the whole way. Down in the comments, I want you to write this exact line. And it's a real quote from a real letter sent by the assassins to a medieval ruler who had made the mistake of threatening them. Write this: "What has to be done will be done." Just that. If you know, you know. And if you've been enjoying this channel, the subscribe button is right there. It costs you nothing, and it means I can keep making these. We've got a lot more history coming. History that is stranger, darker, and more interesting than anything you were taught in school. Stay curious. I'll see you in the next one.